When I was in class this last couple of days, preaching class, I heard an excellent sermon. One of the other students just did a super sermon on that scripture. And I would cheerfully have ripped it off if I had known that's what he was going to do. So you're not going to hear that one. I'm going to talk about the Old Testament today instead. I'll admit you don't often hear me talking about Old Testament scripture. And there's a reason for that. Actually, there's a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it's just so Old Testament. You know, the cultures are just vastly different from anything that we deal with today. Which is not to say that first century AD culture is an open book to us, but we can still sort of connect to it. We still have to struggle sometimes to put things into context, but we can kind of make sense of it. But in the Old Testament, you know, we've got animal sacrifice going on, we've got child sacrifice, we've got people rising up and smiting one another at the drop of a hat. We've got God smiting people all the time, it seems. And they got the funny names. Don't get me started on the names. Ask anyone who's ever had to stand up here and read about Abiasaph or Abinadab, or the Edomites or the Trilobites or whoever. So it's just alien to us. And it's hard to connect to. Takes a lot more work. Reason number two is that the Old Testament can be brutal. Certainly the New Testament has its moments, but Old Testament would get in what they call a hard R in the movie business, if you read much of it. And the New Testament, the Gospels, the Epistles, they are much more hopeful. It's sort of like skipping to the end of the story. We read the Bible. As Christians, we read it as building up to Jesus. So for us modern-era Christians, let's face it, our attention spans are pretty much fixed to the period between commercials. About as long as we can think. So we just jump ahead. Let's get to the good part. So looking back 2,500 years or 3,000 years even, it's hard to believe that we could relate to anything in the Old Testament. Well, most of us like 23rd Psalm, so there's that. We can connect. We connect with Noah, kind of. You know, it's got animals in it. But then there's that whole destruction of humanity thing. That's kind of a bummer. We could sort of connect with the Ten Commandments. We like Charlton Heston. So we get behind Ten Commandments, even if we're not always maybe so good about keeping them. We can understand the whole begetting thing that goes on. But then what? Where are we left then? What or where or how do we connect with something more than 2,500 years old? Things are just too different now, aren't they? Or maybe could still connect. I have my example, please.
Jesus.
So you recognize the Old Testament reading. That can be pretty relatable 2,500 years later. For me anyway, hearing those words, and those are the words of that psalm, some of them, I can feel the sadness behind the song. I hear those words and I can feel the pain and the sense of being displaced and powerless, helpless in the grip of a foreign power. You change the place name and it could be about any people displaced by any war in the last 3,000 years. You could even, not to get into the politics of it, but you could even imagine being in an immigrant detention center, not sure what's going to happen. You can connect with those words. The Psalm 137 depicts the heartbreak of a time that we call the Babylonian exile or the Babylonian captivity. And that was a time, you might remember, when huge parts of Israel, huge parts of the population of Israel were forcibly deported to Babylon as a result of losing a war. And the idea was that by taking the entire upper and middle class and many of the craftsmen and just so many people out of Israel and resettling them in Babylon where they could be, and an eye could be kept on them, that Babylon could then not have to worry about Israel. And as a result of that forced deportation, the displaced population of Israel mourned the loss of their homes and lives for 70 years. Occurs to me just now, literally. You can imagine that same feeling, perhaps along the trail of tears. Or other times when Americans were displaced and forced to go live somewhere not their home. You could feel the pain that they felt. The interesting thing is, and you have to dig for this a little bit, the interesting thing is that when the nation of Israel came out on the other side of the tragedy of exile, it was a stronger, better nation. We should explain that. Not unlike that other great movement of the people of Israel when they fled Egypt. That again was a time when people were suddenly uprooted from their homes and forced to go to a foreign land, and they were made homeless for generations. Not unlike the Exodus. The great crisis that was the Babylonian exile not only resulted in hardship and heartbreak, but it also resulted in the determination to redefine and restructure their identity in a way that adapted to the situation and defined who they were. Changes occurred in the culture of Israel that would be with them up into Jesus' time, almost 600 years later, and would continue on. First of these was that the occasional Hebrew fling with idolatry, which went on throughout the early Old Testament, that was gone. After being displaced to Babylon, that just ended. And it was never a major problem anymore. The second thing is that being separated from the temple, which remember was the center of worship for the people of Israel, being separated from that all of a sudden kick-started the creation of the scribes. The scribes were a class of religious scholars who were dedicated to writing and preserving the scriptures. Scholars now believe, in many ways, the creation of the Old Testament, as we know it, owes a debt to the Babylonian exile. Because as the people languished in Babylon, and they tried to figure out who they were and gather up their national identity, they started grabbing all of the scriptural stuff, all of their old traditions, writing them down. And those became the books of the Bible that we're familiar with today. And third, in place of the temple, which was now gone, new places of worship called synagogues were founded. Without synagogues, keeping the faith alive in the absence of the temple would have been impossible. Synagogues gave rise to Pharisees. The Pharisees, often antagonists of Jesus in the gospel, but the Pharisees were also the keepers of the faith while they were in exile. The Jewish people developed a renewed interest in the Scriptures. They realized that Scripture was what separated them from all of the other surrounding kingdoms and tribes. And they also realized that Scripture was the way of handing down and preserving the history of their covenant with God. Scripture became sacred to them. And through studying Scripture, they eventually realized why they had been thrown into exile. And all of these things together reunified the people in a way that they hadn't seen since the Exodus. So as difficult as it was, as traumatic as it was, even though it caused them to lament their fate and wonder where God had gone in their suffering, or maybe because of that, people of Israel were ultimately strengthened by the experience. And I think that's one more way that we can relate to the dusty, musty old books of the Old Testament. Because when you look at the encouragement that they can offer in times of trouble, when you look at the thread of God's promise to God's people that is always there, it's always present to be grabbed onto if you have the persistence and the patience, then the Old Testament books are a message of hope and fellowship. It's our spiritual ancestors 100 generations ago saying, yeah, we had problems too. But by relying on God and by finding God in the midst of the pain and the chaos, we made it through. And so can you. Whether that chaos is personal, and we've all had chaos in our lives at some point, or whether it's social, we can certainly look at society today and see chaos. Even if it's chaos within the very structure of the denomination that we belong to, and we can see that. By sorting through what it means to be welcoming and affirming, by sorting through these things, by sorting through what's going on in our lives, and always clinging to the Word of God, we find hope. That anchor is always there. The Word is always there waiting for us. The Word is always there waiting to encourage us. Give us something to model. Give us a reason to
go forward.